Thank you very much, Mark. Can you hear me? Is this on?
Yes.
I always like to begin speeches by begging mercy from the interpreters and thanking them in advance for their good work. Because if they don't do their work well, then those of you who are not listening in English will not understand what I have to say, and that would be, from my point of view, unfortunate. I would also note that since my good friend and colleague John Whitty is not here, I had written a longer version of this paper, which the interpreters have. I'm going to read from a shorter version, so I'll be skipping a bit, although not skipping around. The sequence will be the same. Thank you, Mark. Thank you to LUMSA and to St. John's Law School for the honor of being invited to this important conference, and I very much look forward to kicking it off, as we say, with what I hope will be some provocative remarks, at least clear remarks. The great American Jesuit theologian and political philosopher John Courtney Murray once said there's a difference between disagreement and confusion. Disagreement is an achievement, confusion is a failure, so let's try to make this, at a minimum, the achievement of principled disagreement for those of you who may disagree with what I have to say. Hopefully I've set this up, this controversial topic of religious freedom, well enough. Let me begin. In my view, religious freedom in full is necessary. It's necessary for individual human flourishing, as well as for the social, economic, and political success of nations. And yet, mounting evidence suggests that the early 21st century is witnessing a rapid worldwide decline in religious freedom, what might reasonably be called a global crisis in religious freedom. Long brewing outside the West, the crisis has spread to the United States and to Western democracies in general. The symptoms of the crisis vary widely, from vicious physical abuse to the mere privatization of religion, but they emerge from a common diseased root, a failure to credit the religious nature of man, and the consequent need of individuals and societies for a vigorous system of religious freedom, valued in culture and protected in law. Unfortunately, the meaning and reach of this problem are often misunderstood or ignored in the West. We are all outraged by the vile religious persecution of the Nigerian schoolgirls by Boko Haram, or the despicable torture by the Sudanese government of Miriam Ibrahim, the Christian woman who refused to convert to Islam, was arrested and forced to have her baby in a filthy Sudanese prison, and was sentenced to death for apostasy. As I say, we're all outraged by this form of religious persecution. But outrage is not enough. On occasion, international condemnation can have the effect of freeing someone from harm's way, and that is manifestly a good thing. But it does nothing, little or nothing, to address the causes of religious persecution. And, sad to say, the American policy of advancing international religious freedom, which is highly rhetorical and has no strategic rationale, has largely been anemic and ineffective. We will always have a duty to condemn religious persecution, but if religious freedom is to survive, let alone to spread, governments and societies must be given compelling reasons to alter the habits and structures of persecution. They must be persuaded, for example, that religious freedom is not a Trojan horse designed to undermine their respective cultures, but that it is necessary to their own well-being. In short, the case for religious freedom must be rediscovered by Western elites and advanced in their foreign policies, not as an imposition on those who now resist it, but as a necessary step to achieving their own goals. Presenting this self-interest argument should be a signal task of Western diplomacy. The fact that it is not, or not yet, is part of the problem. Now, the case, or my case, for religious freedom begins with the proposition that religious freedom is an individual, social, and political good precisely because religion is a good. This, of course, is contested ground. While there is abundant evidence in the international covenants, human rights instruments, and national constitutions of a commitment to something called religious freedom, or freedom of religion and belief, or the other formulations, people of goodwill have profound disagreements over the content, value, and reach of that freedom. This disparity exists in part because opinion shapers, especially those in the academy, the policy world, and the secular media, do not agree on what religion is, what it is that people have a right to do under the protection of a constitutional or civil right to religious freedom. Among other things, this disagreement includes the question of whether religion is most accurately seen as a set of doctrinal commitments, a social or ethnic identity, or some other sociological attribute that is less chosen than it is inherited. While eminent scholars have invested much time and energy complexifying the various meanings of religion, a reasonable definition can be quite straightforward and can capture, in my view, most, if not all, of the world's religious traditions, as well as the contemporary phenomena of individualized spirituality, or believing without belonging, or the rise of the nuns. Indeed, that's N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. Indeed, this definition proceeds from an understanding of human nature rather than from any particular religion. In my view, religion is the universal human search for a greater than human source of being and of ultimate meaning. So long as humans have existed, they have engaged in this search, asking, as it were, the religious questions. For example, is there a greater than human ultimate reality to which or to whom I owe my being, and to which or to whom I should attune my behavior? If I conclude that such a reality does in fact exist, it's quite reasonable that I should want and seek to know and commune with that reality, and to understand what it requires of me in the way that I organize my life and that of those around me. It's reasonable for me to ask whether there is life after death, and if so, whether my behavior in this life, with respect to a greater than human ultimate reality and my fellow man, will affect my fate in the next. I believe that the right to religious freedom is grounded precisely in the value of that enterprise, of answering those questions, of religion, that is to say, as a human good. The search for a greater than human source of being and ultimate meaning is self-evidently necessary to human flourishing. To deny a person the right to engage in this search as his conscience demands, and to live in accord with the truths he discovers, is to deny the very essence of what it means to be human. Nor is religion the merely emotional exercise imputed to it by those who would dismiss religious beliefs as mere alchemy. There are, of course, aspects of religion that are revealed and must in the end be accepted on faith or not. But much of religion, including revelation, is subject to reason and rational discourse. Religious truth, in short, constitutes an ultimate intelligible reason for human action. It is in this sense that religion should be seen as a fundamental human good and as an activity worthy of special protection in law and culture. There are, of course, other ways to ground religious freedom, including the conviction that God wishes people to come to Him freely. For those who believe this, as do many Christians, Jews, and some Muslims, this constitutes a powerful incentive to protect religious liberty. Others believe that religious freedom is necessary for civil peace. Without it, religions and their adherents will inevitably clash. Today, some scholars attribute this motive to the American founders who fashioned the religion clauses of the American First Amendment to the Constitution. According to this interpretation, the First Amendment's ban on the establishment of religion was designed to protect the government and the public from the pernicious effects of religious divisiveness. Still others understand religious freedom as an aspect of personal autonomy, merely one element of a right to privacy. A right to privacy which is that contemporary, ever-expanding, rights-bearing vessel, which in the United States also contains a constitutional right to consensual sex, to contraception, and to abortion. In this sense, the act of religion is an intimate personal choice that deserves legal protection, although no more than any other personal intimate choice, and less than some, less than many. This understanding of religious freedom as a private right doubtless helps to explain the movement of religion and therefore religious freedom in Western Europe and in the United States out of public life. It helps to explain why increasingly in the United States we hear of a right to worship, as if that were the sole content of religious freedom. For my part, I accept the view that God desires religious freedom because he wishes his creatures to come to him freely. But I recognize that those who do not believe in God, or in this kind of God, are not likely to be persuaded by such an understanding. On the other hand, I reject as ahistorical the idea that the American founders saw religion as something dangerous to be controlled by the ban on establishment of religion, the Establishment Clause. To the contrary, there's ample evidence that the founding generation of my own country believed that public manifestations of religion were necessary to the success of the American democratic experiment. The purpose of the Establishment Clause was to protect religion from the state, not the opposite. By the same token, the purpose of the other part of the First Amendment, the Free Exercise Clause, was precisely to invite religion into the public square. As our first American president, George Washington, put it, and I quote, "Religion and morality are indispensable supports to political prosperity," unquote. I also reject the idea that religion is merely a private activity consisting exclusively of prayer and worship. For most religious people, the act of religion includes such things, but also has distinct public dimensions, such as caring for the poor as a religious obligation and for the defenseless, educating the young, creating and running civil society institutions or for-profit businesses according to particular religious norms, sharing religious truths with others, and making religious claims to inform and shape the laws and the public life of a nation. In sum, I see religion as a basic human good with inevitable public dimensions. All of us humans engage in it in some fashion, even if somewhere along the way we reject it, as have public intellectuals like Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and others. I believe that religion is natural to human beings and is necessary to their flourishing, both individually and in society. So if then religion is a fundamental human good, then religious freedom must be more than a private right. Indeed, it follows that the legal right must be broad and capacious. That is, the right of every person to an immunity from coercion in matters religious. Those of you familiar with Dignitatis Humanae, which was quoted by the Holy Father today, will hear some of that in this definition. It is an immunity from coercion in matters religious. It includes a right to believe and to worship or not. And if one is a religious believer, to act on the basis of belief in the public life of one's nation, both as an individual and as a member of a religious community. Religious freedom entails the right to criticize one's own religion and that of others, and to exit one's religious community, to leave one's religious community without civil or criminal penalty. It includes the right to engage in civil society, business, politics, on the basis of one's religious beliefs, as well as the right of individuals and groups to make religion-based arguments for laws and policies on a basis of full equality with non-religious arguments, and to prevail with those arguments within a democratic system. Now, let me emphasize that such a vigorous, capacious understanding of religious freedom has never existed. It's an ideal. It's never existed in full anywhere. In my view, it does reflect the goals of the American founders and has come closest to realization in the United States. To the extent that religious freedom in full has existed in that country, it has made a significant contribution to such social, political, intellectual, and economic success as American citizens have enjoyed. Unfortunately, there is evidence that religious freedom is declining in the United States as it is globally. Now, let me now summarize what in the paper I presented for this, in the longer version for this conference, is the evidence for the assertion that there is a global crisis in religious liberty. In the longer paper, which you're free to consult, I have provided data from 4 comprehensive studies published by the nonpartisan Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C., drawing on a wide variety of separate and independent sources. Pew has measured restrictions on religious liberty in 198 countries between the years 2007 and 2012. Although this is a limited window of time, the picture painted by the Pew reports is compelling, clear, and alarming. At the beginning of the picture, at the beginning of this period, in 2007, restrictions on religion were already high, but in the years since, they have gotten steadily worse. Let me give you a flavor for this. In 2007, 68% of the population in the world lived in countries where, according to the Pew data, religion was either highly restricted or very highly restricted. 68% of the world's population. By 2012, that figure had risen to 76% of the world's population. That's 3 out of 4 people on the planet living in countries where religious freedom, in effect, does not exist. Most of those people live in Muslim-majority countries, communist or post-communist regimes such as China or Vietnam, large authoritarian states such as Myanmar or Russia. But there are also a few democracies such as India and a handful of Western European nations, a subject to which I'll return in just a moment. The Pew reports identify both government restrictions on religion and social hostilities toward religion. Both of those indicators were high in 2011, and both have gotten steadily worse in the years since. For example, social hostilities toward religion reached a 6-year high in 2012, rising from 20% of the world's countries, which had high or very high social hostilities in 2007, to 33% in 2012. Just see the trends here. Even if the percentages can be quibbled with, the trends are very difficult, it seems to me, to deny. The increase in government restrictions over this period is comparable to the increase in social hostilities. One of the most troubling elements of religious freedom's decay is the growth in religion-related violence and terrorism. In 2007, according to the Pew studies, 9% of the world's nations were experiencing this kind of religion-related terrorism. By 2012, that number had more than doubled, reaching almost 20%. Regarding which religious groups are most subject to harassment, the Holy Father touched on this a bit today. The data show that Christians are the most vulnerable, with Muslims a close second. Between 2006 and 12, Christians were harassed or persecuted in 151 nations, Muslims in 135 nations around the world. So, these and other religious minorities are often the victims of cruel violence, such as torture, rape, unjust imprisonment, unjust execution, because of their religious beliefs and practices or those of their tormentors. The examples are legion, and you're probably familiar with many of them. The burning alive of boys and the kidnapping and forced Islamization of girls by the Nigerian terror group Boko Haram. the slaughter of Muslim women and children by Hindu extremists in the Indian province of Gujarat, the ongoing brutalization and dehumanization of the Ahmadiyya minority in Pakistan and Indonesia, the terrible depredations of the al-Qaeda affiliate ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which are going on as we speak. The humanitarian costs in religious liberty of this crisis in religious liberty are staggering, as are the costs in instability and conflict. It is all the more puzzling, then, that the United States and other nations that include religion nominally in their foreign policies have had so little impact on this problem. Now, part of the problem, as we turn to the Western democracies, is that some Western democracies themselves are creeping into the high category of restrictions on religion, according to these Pew reports. Many of us assume that religious persecution occurs exclusively in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, and indeed most of the violent persecution, whether it's done by governments or private groups, does occur outside the West and not inside the West, but there's increasing reason for concern. Listen to this. The Pew data show that in several nations of Western Europe, social hostilities toward religion are rising dramatically. The Pew scores for France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom are so high, showing such high restrictions, such high government social hostility, that they are similar to those of Iran and Saudi Arabia, which I find almost incomprehensible. All of these countries that I've just named are in the category of high social hostilities toward religion. The Pew studies also suggest that problems are emerging in the Americas, in the United States as well. The most salient trend is an increase in government restrictions on religion in the United States. According to the most recent report, the U.S. level of government restrictions has increased by 57% between 2007 and 2012. In 2012, the level of U.S. government restrictions was 54% higher than the global median. In 2007, the U.S. score had been lower than the global median. So I don't think it's necessary to get hung up on these numbers, but the trends are negative everywhere. And this is a cause, in my view, for calling this a crisis, a global crisis in religious liberty. So what's the explanation? How do we explain these rapidly increasing levels of religious persecution in certain regions outside the West, and for the decline of religious freedom inside the West, including in the United States? In most of the countries where religious persecution is on the rise, in particular Muslim-majority countries such as Egypt, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, plus the communist or post-communist nations of North Korea, China, Vietnam, Cuba. In addition to that, Russia, Myanmar, and India, religious freedom has never been accepted in these countries in full, in law, or in culture. The one significant exception to that statement is India. The world's largest democracy, India has a huge Muslim minority, larger than the entire population of the Middle East. Since its birth in 1948, amid some of the most terrible interreligious massacres ever recorded, India has made remarkable progress toward what I would call a halfway house to religious freedom, namely religious tolerance. But even tolerance is at risk with the emergence of a radical form of Hinduism in elements of the BJP party, whose approach to Muslim, Christian, and other minorities is harsh, anti-democratic, and illiberal. The fact that the BJP is leading the current Indian government will likely have significant negative consequences for religious freedom there. As for the other non-Western nations where religious persecution is on the rise, however, nothing approximating religious freedom in full has ever existed. There are many reasons for this gap, including skepticism in these nations that religious freedom is either useful for their societies or compatible with their respective religious traditions. In some, there is a suspicion that religious freedom is a form of Western cultural imperialism, that seeks, for example, to move Islam to the margins of political life in Muslim-majority countries in favor of Christianity. For those who believe this, including some in Europe and the United States, religious freedom constitutes a threat that must be resisted. Such views constitute a major obstacle to attempts by the United States or any other nation to develop effective religious freedom policies and to advance them successfully. This perception of U.S. cultural imperialism is deeply ironic. The American model of religious freedom has historically included religion in political life in a way that could presumably have some appeal to Muslim-majority nations. It is the French model of laïcité that has sought to privatize religion in a way that seems incompatible with Islamic history and practice. Unfortunately, Muslim-majority publics seem to believe that American foreign policy would not accommodate Islam in public life, but would impose an American form of laïcité that privatizes or seeks to privatize Islam, and therefore would be opposed to Muslim-majority interests. Unfortunately, this perception contains a substantial element of truth. Notwithstanding their own history, American foreign policy elites have, for the most part, abandoned the American model of religious liberty for the French. I once wrote a piece in a blog called Public Discourse, Why American Foreign Policy Elites Are Becoming French. A phenomenon that helps explain, in my view, the relative ineffectiveness of U.S. international religious freedom policy. Some would say that's an insult to the French rather than to the Americans. One key cause of growing religious persecution is radical, violent religious movements, especially the extremist Islamism that is providing the theological oxygen for transnational and regional terrorist groups of the Al-Qaeda variety. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, for example, the Al-Nusra Front in Syria and Lebanon, and Boko Haram in Nigeria. In other forms, extremist versions of Islam pervade Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan, and dominate the discourse about religious freedom in many other Muslim-majority nations. Most contemporary religion-related terrorist movements are led by Islamists who believe they're carrying out God's will and defending Islam. An unwillingness to credit this theological motive helps account for attempts by the United States and others to defeat Islamist terrorism almost exclusively with military force, intelligence services, drones, and legal procedures. These actions have been highly controversial, very expensive, and largely ineffective. To the extent that terrorism is driven by a sense of religious obligation, it is unlikely to be defeated exclusively by force or the threat of force. Muslim opinion shapers must have the will and the means to discredit the religious rationale for violence. I believe, based on my experience, that every Muslim country has leaders who, given the opportunity, will make arguments from the Islamic tradition, from the heart of Islam, that Islam need not be defended with violence, that it can support equality and law and culture for all of its citizens. But in order to make these arguments and to convince others that they are true, Muslim leaders must possess religious freedom. In most Muslim-majority countries today, the public presentation of such arguments will result in official charges of blasphemy, or in some cases in mob violence. Of course, violent Islamism is not the only form of religious radicalism that is fueling persecution in the world today. Extremist Hinduism, as I mentioned, is threatening democracy in India. Radical forms of Buddhism are fomenting violent persecution in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, although they are not the only causes of violence in those countries. In Russia, the Orthodox Church has too often allied itself with authoritarianism in order to preserve what it believes to be its rightful monopoly on religion in Russia. In North Korea, China, Vietnam, and Cuba, religious persecution is the result of a lingering totalitarian impulse, still attributable to the influence of communism. In China, the central government has found it far easier to achieve economic growth than it has its goal of harnessing and managing the power of religion, especially evangelical forms of Christianity. My colleague and Purdue scholar Fenggang Yang has recently predicted that by 2030, more than 247 million Chinese will be Christians, more than the Christian population of any country on the face of the earth. The question is, how will the Chinese government react? How will they deal with this stunning growth, if it's true? Will it react with vicious and violent force, overpowering force, as it did in Tiananmen Square, as it has with the Falun Gong? Or will it find ways to accommodate Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, short of violence and repression? This is a major but largely unexplored issue for Western foreign policies. Inside the West, the single most powerful cause of the decline of religious freedom, in my view, is the rise of militant secularism, defined either as the rejection of religion altogether or the insistence that it move out of public life. Militant secularism is supported, especially in Western Europe, by the abandonment of and growing hostility toward religion in general by substantial numbers of people. But it's also supported by liberal Protestant and Catholic movements that seek to privatize religion and reduce its impact on culture, law, and public policy. The most plausible explanation for this phenomenon is, in my view, not difficult to identify. Traditional forms of Protestantism and Catholicism and Orthodoxy offer the primary and frequently the sole obstacle to the acceptance in law and culture of modern liberalism's lifestyle individualism, including state-sanctioned sexual liberation, same-sex marriage, liberalized abortion, unilateral divorce, euthanasia, the medical usage of embryos and embryonic stem cells, and other similar goals. Now, there's much to be said here about Western Europe, but I want to focus in my time remaining on the United States. While the data suggests that the decline of religious freedom, as I mentioned, is less dramatic than in Europe, the trend lines, as everywhere else, are distinctly negative. So what can we conclude from the data about the United States? First, we should approach them with some skepticism and caution. 6 years of statistical trends does not provide certainty about the long-term fate of religious liberty in the United States, or frankly anywhere else. Moreover, no one is going to jail in the United States for his or her religious views and practices, at least not yet. One can express the sincere hope that such a tragedy will never befall that nation or any other Western democracy. But the anecdotal evidence, some of which reflects decades-long trends, provides additional reason for worry. In a recent lecture surveying this evidence, Harvard Law professor Marianne Glendon noted, and I quote, that the rights of religious entities in the United States to choose their own personnel and even to publicly teach and defend their positions on controversial issues are coming under intensive attack, unquote. So let me mention just a bit of the evidence, just a narrow slice of the evidence, that I would suggest is not appearing in the Pew Forum reports. It's not being measured. I'm going to cite 3 developments, each having to do with the issue of same-sex marriage. First, in 2010, a federal judge, not a state judge, but a federal judge in the United States, overturned a state referendum from the state of California, which had been held 2 years earlier, in 2008, on what is known in the United States as Proposition 8. This was a referendum on what the California state constitution would say with respect to marriage. And by a fairly substantial margin, the people of California voted in this referendum that marriage in that state would mean in law a union of one man and one woman, a definition that had been deeply rooted in law and culture. As I say, this federal judge overturned this referendum, and one of his stated rationales for declaring it unconstitutional was that proponents of marriage had made arguments grounded in religion and morality, and that such arguments could not provide a rational basis for the referendum's outcome. I would submit that this dictum, a legal declaration that religious and moral arguments are by their nature irrational and therefore unconstitutional, is false and constitutes a grave threat to religious liberty and indeed American democracy itself. Second development. The Supreme Court of the United States last year declared as unconstitutional a 1996 law entitled the Defense of Marriage Act, which had been passed with large congressional majorities in 1996 by both parties in the United States and signed by a Democratic President, William Clinton, defining marriage as it had been in the California referendum. Writing a mere 17 years later, that is to say last year in 2012, in the Windsor case decision, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy asserted that those who defend marriage as it was defined in the Defense of Marriage Act and has been defined by all civilizations for millennia are acting with malice. Their goal, wrote Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, is to disparage, to injure, to degrade, to demean homosexual individuals, to brand them as unworthy, and to humiliate their children. In short, those Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others who insist on maintaining the traditional definition of marriage are to be branded as haters, the bigots of the 21st century. The law is a great teacher, but in Windsor, the law, expressed through the voice of Justice Kennedy, is teaching a malicious and malevolent untruth, one with corrosive effects on religious freedom and on American democracy. The effects can be seen in my third example, the case of Mr. Brendan Eich. Mr. Eich was named CEO of Mozilla Corporation. He was discovered, after being named the chief executive officer, to have contributed $1,000 to support traditional marriage in the aforementioned California Proposition 8 referendum. When Mr. Eich's contribution was discovered, much of the American secular media and political punditry, following the lead of Justice Anthony Kennedy, branded Eich a hater and a bigot. Realizing that such vitriol and anger, however unjust, would ensure he could not perform his job, Mr. Eich resigned. There are many examples of court decisions, executive actions, and cultural trends that demand the removal of religion-related and religion-based moral ideas and institutions from public life in the United States. Some seek this outcome because they believe traditional religion poses an obstacle to equality. I submit that such an attitude is short-sighted. The purging of traditional moral arguments from public life threatens the system of religious freedom on which American democracy and its understanding of equality is grounded and has long relied. An effective system of religious freedom requires that all voices, secular and religious, have an equal opportunity to be heard, and if they are persuasive enough, to prevail in law and public policy. The American founders fashioned the First Amendment in order to ensure the presence of religious voices, Christian and non-Christian, in political and civil society. They believed those voices necessary to guarantee a moral citizenry and to limit the power of government. The judicially encouraged banishment of a particular point of view from American life, especially one with deep roots in law and culture, represents a thoroughly un-American act of intolerance and a step toward tyranny. Further, the attack on public manifestations of religion, as demonstrated in the current American administration's positions in recent court cases, perhaps we'll have a chance to speak of them, constitutes an assault on civil society. In the American system, religion-based nonprofit and for-profit entities, such as schools, universities, hospitals, orphanages, AIDS hospices, immigrant services, soup kitchens, and the like, are the backbone of civil society, faith-based organizations. As such, they act as a check on state power, both by providing services that without them the government would have to provide, and even more importantly, by positing an authority greater than the state. History has amply demonstrated that among the threats to human equality fashioned by men, few rival the destructive power of the state. Let me conclude by summarizing some practical reasons why those who resist religious freedom in full, whether they are Western liberals, Indian Hindus, Chinese atheists, or Muslim skeptics, should reconsider their respective positions. Although space and time don't permit an exploration of precisely how these ideas would be integrated into the foreign policies of Western nations, they could be used as a guideline. They could be guided by these principles. First, there's growing evidence that religious freedom is necessary for a democracy to survive, to flourish, to remain stable. There's empirical evidence that successful democracy requires what my colleague Brian Grimm calls a bundled commodity of fundamental freedoms. Religious freedom is not the only one of those freedoms, but it acts, as do others, as a linchpin within the bundle. Without this linchpin of religious freedom, the other rights and freedoms, for example, freedom of speech, freedom of association, or the equality of all citizens under the law, those freedoms and rights alone cannot do the work of consolidating democracy and rendering it stable without religious freedom. Such evidence, properly developed, could be employed in any country struggling to achieve stable democracy in pursuit of its own interests, including countries like Egypt, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Indonesia, Russia, Myanmar, and India. Evidence of the connection between religious freedom and the health of democracy also provides reason for reflection by Western elites, who in effect are demanding the demolition of religious liberty in order to achieve state-enforced lifestyle individualism and a false, impoverished equality. Theirs will be a Pyrrhic victory indeed if it feeds an authoritarianism in which only state-approved voices can be heard. Second, religious freedom can make an important contribution to economic development. This, to me, is one of the most exciting developments in the field of religious freedom. Economic development, the reduction of poverty, and social development in general. Sociologists like Brian Grimm and Roger Finke have analyzed the cross-national relationship between religious liberty on the one hand and numerous other indicators of economic development and political freedom on the other. They found particularly robust statistical relationships, not only between religious freedom and political freedom, and the longevity of democracy, but also lower poverty and greater economic freedom, greater equality between men and women, and a whole host of other social, economic, political, and intellectual goods. Now, these correlations are strong enough to suggest a causal mechanism at work. The presence of religious freedom can contribute to economic, social, and political goods. Its absence or decline can undermine those goods. The connection between religious liberty and economic dynamism was once well understood in the West. That is no longer the case. Finally, religious freedom can help defeat religion-related violence and terrorism. Especially in Muslim-majority nations, anti-blasphemy laws suppress moderate and liberal voices within the Islamic tradition and ensure that public discourse is dominated by extremist arguments. The most destructive of those arguments, widely accepted among Muslim publics, is the argument that anyone who defames Islam deserves punishment by the state or, in the absence of state action, by private actors. Precisely because this assertion is so widely accepted, it provides a cultural underpinning for violent Islamist extremism. Religious freedom in full would free moderate voices within the Islamic tradition, speaking from the heart of Islam, to champion more liberal versions of Islamic practice, including ideas of equality between men and women, and Muslims and non-Muslims. Perhaps most importantly, such voices would argue, as did, for example, the late former Prime Minister of Indonesia, Abdurrahman Wahid, who argued that God neither needs nor requires men to defend him with violence. He is greater than that. There are many reasons for societies everywhere to embrace religious freedom. Foremost among them, the moral imperative to rid the world of the vile acts of persecution of which the Holy Father spoke this morning, that are increasing with such alarming rapidity, causing terrible human suffering and darkening our future. Such human acts of evil and the suffering they cause will always be with us. We should never tire of condemning them and countering them, including, when appropriate and necessary, with force. But we must also discover the powerful practical reasons for religious liberty, reasons that are grounded in the religious nature of man, his consequent need for freedom, and the value of religious freedom for social flourishing. Those reasons, apparent at the American founding, are in danger of being lost, and yet they can and should be understood as reflecting the interests of all people everywhere: stable self-governance, economic development, and the defeat of religion-based violence and terror. If we act to discover and rediscover these truths ourselves, we can avert the momentous consequences of a global crisis in religious freedom. Thank you very much.